Well, I hope everybody's doing well today. I'll print out a copy for myself here. Actually, I think my printer's down. Let me just talk through this one. So I like to talk about a comparison between organic growing and hydroponic growing. And just I asked before we came on here, can you do organic hydroponics? And absolutely yes. So we're going to talk through that, and then we're also going to talk about organics from a literal standpoint and hydroponics from a literal standpoint. And I think what you'll draw from it is just how to kind of align your intentions with how you want to grow the plants to the application that you're using. So I think that'll be pretty clear. So look forward to any questions you might have. There's a lot of different variables when it comes to hydroponics. This is not going to be a full-on hydroponic presentation, but we will talk through the broad strokes of how to maintain a system. I think that's important to really understand the control that you're giving yourself and the responsibility that comes with that in growing plants. So here's a statement, a plant is a plant. It's literally true. I mean, as simple sounding as it is, whether a plant's growing on Mars or, in your hall closet or in your backyard or on your farm, the plant requires the same things, what we talked about last week, right? The air, light, water, and balanced ions. So, we know pretty well the requirements of plants. One of the things that I'm going to harp on as we go through some of this information is to just imagine what it is we may be missing. It's not difficult to grow a plant, including in hydroponics. It's one of the benefits of it is that the hard part in terms of the balance of the elements that the plant requires has been done for you. You're just worried about the amount of the fertilizer. So, with knowledge of these plant requirements, of how to, manage your environment, control your temperatures, your humidities, your air exchange, the light, grow lights if you're growing indoors, the right kind of water. We're going to have some real fun, detailed talk about activated water in the future, and then, the fertilizer. And so, on some level, it's really simple to grow a plant. I mean, you go plant in your yard and it'll grow. Just hopefully, if your soil is unlike the soil that we have here locally in Wilmington, North Carolina, maybe. But the point being, those requirements are basic towards any application that you want to accomplish plant growth. From there, you can start to look at from the fertility standpoint at different levels of fertility. You have the ions. We talked about that last week, basically in a compost pile or whether it's salts from a hydroponic fertilizer, the plant's eating those ions in a very simple way of saying it. Then the plant makes glucose, right? We talked through that. Those glucose are then taken through the respiration process after photosynthesis to then be turned into all of the metabolites that the plant needs to be a plant. So the glucose is turned into vitamins and amino acids and enzymes and all sorts of different metabolites, photosynthates. A couple words to use to describe the category of what the plant's producing. I like to call them biocatalysts. It's basically everything but the ions. Ions are the raw components. The biocatalysts are what the plant makes for itself, and the hormones regulate the process of the plant, not unlike people, right? Like we can't grow a beard when we're 4 years old. Our body hasn't reached that genetic predisposition to be able to do that yet. And it's the same with a plant. A tomato plant can't produce a tomato in the first 4 weeks of its growth. It's got to get to that 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 week, depending on what your variety is, to start showing the flowers. That's a bit like the facial hair and the height growth and puberty. It's really a similar transition in the being of that plant. So those hormones are naturally derived in the plant based on genetic predisposition. They can also be used proactively. I'm not really a big proponent of that. I have used rooting gels in my day. Those are a rooting hormone, a signal that it's indole 3-butylic acid, and that hormone can be engineered artificially, not unlike ascorbic acid is to be called vitamin C. for example, and all the juice that we drink and that kind of thing. But and what it's doing is it's sending that signal at a higher rate than the plant does on its own, and does induce better root growth. So root gels, root powders, things like that are pretty ubiquitous in the commercial agriculture realm. And some of the other hormones, gibberellic acid, you can get into a lot of different angles there. Is really kind of messing with the magic, in my opinion. They're highly regulated by the EPA, obviously, because they can create deformities and frogs and different things like that. So, tread lightly. But the concept, not really endorsing the product usage of hormones, but the concept of hormones is relevant. So you have this signal, and then you have the plant accessing the fertility from its environment and turning it into everything that it needs to express its plantness. And the diet that we provide the plant, particularly in hydroponics, but even so in soil, especially in developed property or chemically treated property, deficient soil, what we provide for that plant to access determines the success of that plant during its life. So in a nutshell, that's, progressive farming, bioenergetic agriculture is really maximizing and balancing these components of awareness from a physical, mineral, biological, and energetic perspective. So what I wanted to talk about today was, like I said, just a comparison between organic growing and hydroponics. So I find it worthwhile just to talk about the term organic. You probably had some of the same thoughts if you drill down on what organic is. Over the last 15 years, my experience in engaging organic growing is that people look at it for something that it's not. And that's not necessarily people's fault. It's not necessarily intentional. It's simply that, what does organic mean? Well, in a general sense, it's relating to or derived from living matter. And that makes sense. Anything that's organic was alive, carbon backbone, that defines life. In 2002, the USDA formalized the National Organic Program and created organic growing. And what it is basically a method of what not to do, in my opinion. Don't use pesticides, don't use genetically modified organisms, don't use things that are artificial. And what it really means is don't use anything that hasn't been endorsed or allowed by the USDA in terms of this certification. So it's a good step in the right direction. I personally don't feel that organics gets us where we want to go. I'm not sure that, frozen food at Walmart certified organic was really the intention of the origin of the organic movement. But, it does help us make buying decisions that encourage people that are looking more towards growing cleaner food. And on that, hands down, it's a big step in the right direction. But it is not a mandate on healthy food. It doesn't assure that the plant is grown to its maximum genetic potential in terms of nutrient density, trace elements. It does not guarantee no pesticides. A lot of people have that mindset. If I buy organic, there's no pesticides. I remember being at the Acres Conference. This was maybe 10 years ago, and maybe it wasn't that long ago. But there was an organization there. They're giving a presentation, and they were from California, and they had done some DNA testing on soybeans in California. And what they found was very alarming. 60% of the certified organic soybeans that they tested had multiple forms of pesticides in and on the plant. The only explanation is really drift. And in big agricultural communities, there's a tremendous amount of it. So does that organic crop have less than conventional? I think that's fair to say. It's not fair to say that it has none. Same with fertility. It was a year or two ago, there was a big push by the food system. I don't really know any other way to say it, where you started to see a lot of articles coming out about how organic food wasn't as good for you, or it didn't prove to be more nutrient dense. I could sit here for an hour and argue with that. I don't think that that's a fair assessment of organics. I think, if you use something like fish emulsion, it's got 50, 60 elements in it without you even have to think about it. If you look at an inventory of the number of elements used on a farm, a conventional farm, it can be as low as 5. So, the diversity of what they're approaching the system with is deficient, and there is no way that you can compare the fertility of the two. on balance. Now, can you find an organic farm that's certified that's growing inferior food? Absolutely. You know, again, it's not a mandate on healthy food. The book, The Intelligent Gardener, really good one to check out. He tells a story in the beginning, the author does, about he was in Oregon, bought a homestead, I think it was like 8 acres, and started farming it. And this was during the organic movement in the Rodale. All you need is compost, back in the 70s, I believe it was. And he was saying how they were making the compost and applying it and doing all the right things. And they were having some level of success, but he had teeth that were falling out, and you know, he was having health issues. And he moved to Fiji with his wife for 6 months to finish a book that he was writing, and ate conventional food while he was there, but it was all grown on volcanic soil. And he said his teeth remineralized, and he noticed he was healthier. So his takeaway was that organics wasn't what mandated that. It was in what he was treading on, which I think is entirely accurate, is you want to make sure that you get your nutrient density through your mineral balance. And, you know, the organic compost and things like that is trace elements, you know, on that level, but it's not a fertilization. It's the organic matter, it's the microbes, it's everything else. And you can kind of see where I'm coming at with bioenergetics. It's not just about plowing and fertilizing. It's also not just about applying compost. It's also not just about spraying field sprays and frequencies energetically to influence the system. It's a combination of all of that brings the best agronomy. So the cool thing is you can apply that mindset, whether you can achieve it in perfection, which is impossible. It can always be better. Can be applied to any type of agronomy, including hydroponics. So it helps to kind of read some of this language. I mean, listen to this on the USDA organic standards. Organic is a labeling term that indicates that the food or other agricultural product has been produced through approved methods. The organic standards describe the specific requirements that must be verified by a USDA accredited certifying agent before products can be labeled USDA organic. And it says, overall, organic operations must demonstrate that they are protecting natural resources, conserving biodiversity, and using only approved substances. So, you know, pretty standard language around a certification process. It's interesting to note that they use the language approved methods. A lot of the standards that started in the NOP program have been diluted to allow different materials that have been accepted by peer review in a boardroom somewhere probably. But the bottom line is, you know, the spirit of this is right. You know, let's be cleaner in what we're doing, and let's pay more attention to the environment that we're influencing through our agronomy. So, you know, the takeaway with organics is, you know, it's a step in the right direction. It is generally cost effective for growers to certify themselves organic at scale, simply because they can achieve a higher price point. But we want to keep our wits about us and apply, you know, the true potential of what the system can be, rather than just relying on those standards alone. So let's talk about hydroponics. Hydroponics is growing plants without soil, soilless growing. It's known as growing plants in water, but, you know, using something like peat moss, you know, like a Pro Mix product or something like that, that's soilless, has no fertility. It's just basically there for proper drainage and to act like a sponge to hold things, is also hydroponics, primarily because the grower has to bring all of the fertility. So that's one way of thinking about hydro, is the grower has to bring the fertility versus, you know, in organic growing, the system is going to bring some residual benefit. In other words, you can't grow a plant in water alone. Even if there's ions in the hardness of your water, it's not enough to drive production. You have to bring that fertilizer. So the word literally means working water. It's a great example of using a natural process for human benefit, like composting. You know, we're leveraging with knowledge of what the plant requires. We can bring that in an ideal form, and it's extremely efficient while doing that. You can use somewhere around a 20th of the water that you would in soil-based growing, just through recirculating it. So there's a pretty interesting history around hydroponics. You know, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, you know, they basically brought river water up into the channels, and it was a form of hydroponics similar to the Chinapas of the Aztecs. They supported civilization of something like 300,000 people. That Chinapas are still in use today, and you can see the image there in the middle image. Is they basically just brought muck up from the bottom of the lakes, put them on these rafts, and planted farms on the rafts, and they could actually pull them around Lake Tenochtitlan, I think it's called. But you can look into the history of the Chinapas and how that was done. So those were kind of some unconscious methods of hydro. I mean, in some respects, the algae that came from the ocean to, habitate the land is hydroponics. So photosynthetic algae is hydroponic. It wasn't until about 1920, somewhere in the early 20s, where Dr. William Garricky coined the term hydroponics and popularized it. He was shown in the front of the New York Times on a big ladder, harvesting a tomato, 15 feet up in the air. And it had a big heyday. And there was actually companies that were formed out of this new technology of food production to sell people for, local commercial use and things like that. But there was a lot of people that were upset with it because there was really no established method to not contaminate the solution. They were doing it in concrete gullies and with metal troughs, and it just didn't really work very well. So the U.S. government picked up on it, and in the world wars developed hydroponic applications over mostly in Southeast Asia, using hydroponic technology to feed the troops. They obviously had the budget to do it, and they put that in play, and it was a very successful thing. It wasn't until about the 1970s, when plastic was invented, that it became commercialized on a large scale and became accessible to homeowners because of the cost effectiveness of plastic and the inert quality of it in terms of plant growth. It could then be used in a more commercial way. So here's some of the benefits of hydroponics. It allows you to create growing environments and idealize them. You can grow plants anywhere. With grow lights, you can literally do it in the basement of your house. You can also grow hydroponics in your backyard under the sun. There is no compatibility with grow lights. There's no reason to do it indoors or out. It's basically just a method of bringing ideal nutrition to the plant. And in doing that and setting the system up, it's, think about it like an automatic watering system. We'll see some diagrams here in a minute that kind of make that clear. But it's just focusing on what the plant wants in the stage of growth that it's in, and providing that. So it's pretty simple in that regard. So, I mentioned you can use a 20th of the water recirculating it versus, I think about 70% of the water you apply to the soil in the earth. It runs through the roots and is not able to be leveraged. So it's extremely efficient. You can get a much higher yield per area, primarily because you're paying more attention about what the plant wants concentrationally from the fertilizer, and the plant grows up instead of down. There's no weeds, and it's replicable. I've actually over the years talked to several banks for farmers that we get hurricanes in southeastern North Carolina, and they lost the farm and they wanted to retool, and they looked at hydroponics and built structures that could protect it from the elements. And the bank was very receptive to that idea of the farm being protected and replicable, almost like an equation in some respects. And we deal with hydroponic growers today, one that's certified organic in the state of Washington that grows a 5-ounce bib lettuce in 45 days, and they have a very neat equation of how many plants they start versus the volume that they need to produce to hit their mark, and it works very, very well. So then you get the people say, oh, well, it's not organic, it's not natural. Is a cornfield natural, right? So let's put some perspective on that. No, hydroponics in and of itself as a technology is not natural. Other than you're using materials that stimulate plant growth to grow plants that I would argue are equal. I would argue that they're more nutritious than conventional food that you find in the grocery store. A lot of that has to do with the relative locality of how it's produced, but it also has to do with the ability of to deliver ideal nutrition to the plants. So that's a fair argument. I'm not one to try to carry that burden of proof to make it natural. I'm actually fine with the concept that hydroponics is not certifiably organic. I think that there are some things that we'll talk about in a minute that should allow people to do that if they were into it. To be honest with you, my personal preference is to grow, if I'm growing in hydroponics, is to use artificial salts. It's a lot simpler. It's a lot, it's just a much smoother process than organic hydroponics. Again, we'll talk through that in a minute. So this really says it all. You can see on the left there, 2 different images. The one on the left says it's a soil plant. I like to make people think about like a bag of potting soil from a garden center. If you're lettuce plant grows at 600 parts per million and a tomato plant grows at 3,500 parts per million. Those are, that's 6 times the amount of the lettuce, right? That's a pretty large difference. So if you plant lettuce and tomatoes, and even though they're seasonally different, but just to make a point, in the same scenario, the lettuce plant's going to have to develop a really extensive root system to get to the surface area to access the fertility that it needs to drive its production. Whereas, the lettuce does what it does. So in soil, you basically sacrifice the tomatoes unless you bring fertilizer, which is the point of fertilizer, right? But make the connection. A lot of people feed everything the same way. It's just a 10-10-10 tablespoon per gallon, water it in. Well, paying more attention to what crop you're growing and what it wants versus what you want to feed it can make an extraordinary difference in your growing. And that's really what hydroponics allows is, with knowledge of the tomato plant, uses 6 times the fertilizer. You can get a nifty little fertility meter, stick it in the water that you're growing the tomato in, and bump it up to 3,000 parts per million. You wouldn't want to grow the lettuce in the same system. It would burn it all up, right? We talked about burning a couple weeks ago. So the parts per million, just to make sure everybody's on the right page, is the parts of ions per million of water. And the root is osmotic. So if the root has more ions in the root than out of the root, water and nutrition is coming into the plant. That's transpiration in a very simple way of describing it. So when you burn a plant, you introduce more ions out of the root than in the root, and water leaves the plant. That's why the tips burn and the edges of the leaf burn. It's being sacrificed. Plants prioritizing. So it's just reversing the osmotic gradient of the root. So in hydro, you kind of want to push the plant to where it burns, and you learn that strain and then step off of it. And if you got a plant that burns at 2,500 and you're running at 2,200, that plant is, most of its energy is being put into reproductive growth, not surface area of root. So you can see that's really the mechanism of why you get a higher yield in hydro. It's not that you're feeding it steroids or something like that. You're just able to more solubly approach the plant to the concentration that it wants to grow in, and it grows up instead of down. So here's some yield benefits, and you can see why it's popular in commercial applications. You can see the tomato per acre is extraordinary, the benefits that you get. Same with the lettuce all the way down the line. It's just from the Bible of hydroponics, hydroponic food production by Howard Resh. Make sure to put that in the show notes. But there is a reason that people gravitate towards hydroponic, not just the replicability and the saving of the water, but you do get a significant yield benefit, particularly when you can start to orient your growing vertically as opposed to horizontally. It takes on a whole another category. So, hydroponics is realizing its potential. I don't know that it's entirely cost effective to start. You see a lot of these vertical skyscraper farm concepts, and at this point, they're frankly mostly concepts. Really cool, but not sure they're really feasible in the way they're being imagined yet. So, not any reason to denigrate them in any way, but there are crops grown in outer space. Using hydroponics. Obviously, they're interested in how to send people to Mars on a year trip and feed them with what they grow rather than an MRE or something like that. And there's also some cool stories about hydroponics at the North Pole. And you can just do a Google search, hydroponics in the North Pole, and I'll look for some, maybe try to put them in the show notes, because it's neat to see. And these people can make a salad out of what they're growing. It gives them a hobby, and even in the isolation in the coldest, most extreme temperatures on Earth. So there are sustainable aspects to hydroponics. In some respects, you're separating the agronomy from the living system. You're creating your own system. So in that, you can grow food closer to people. That's more nutrient dense. That was really the original insight I had in starting Progressive Gardens 15 years ago in my garden center. It's just I'd never grown a plant hydroponically, and I immediately just saw the application of being able to grow crops, where people are in a sustainable way. And, it's gaining in popularity. I got a call last week from a development downtown Wilmington, North Carolina, that has some restaurants going into a residential building that they're renovating, and the basement, they want to put a hydroponic garden in it. They want to, get some marketing out of it and some cool points, some factors in that regard. But, they're interested in connecting that production to the restaurants that they're leasing to. And, we need to see more of that in every way. That's developing personal agriculture, getting people closer to the food, They're going to know where it came from. All of those are really good things in regards to what we need to do to fix our agriculture. So, you know, this is just some simple images of how accessible hydroponics can be. You can build a little water culture system where the roots grow directly into the reservoir, you know, out of a Rubbermaid or a 5-gallon bucket. Not unlike an aquarium setup or brewing compost tea for that matter. You're just aerating the water using an air pump, some tubing to connect it to an air stone. And the air stone is doing nothing but just breaking up the big bubbles out of the tube. Meaning, you know, big bubbles have less surface area than thousands of tiny bubbles. The more surface area you can accomplish, the more dissolved oxygen you can accomplish in the water. And that's what's allowing the respiration of the plant and why the roots don't develop a root disease. If you've ever steeped a plant in your windowsill, you know, and cloned a philodendron or some kind of house plant, you know, that's hydroponics. All we're doing here is stepping it up and allowing the plant to grow to maturity and not exhaust the oxygen in the water that it has access. That is why plants get root disease, is they can't breathe through the roots. It's no different in soil. You know, most of the people that have a black thumb, they just overwater their plants. So, you know, this setting a hydroponic system up, we're aware of that and taking it into account, and it can be done in different ways. You know, referencing indoor gardening, this can be done in soil too, so it doesn't really have anything to do directly with hydroponics, but a lot of people do undertake hydroponic growth indoors in a controlled environment. I think it'd be worthwhile to have a course on this at some point, and we'll probably have a show on it as well. I've got a lot of expertise in regards to how to engineer environments indoors, and it's pretty neat. You can almost sit there and watch the plant grow when you get it dialed in. And, you know, just some images on the efficiency. You can see when you start getting vertical, you know, the ability to, you know, there's an upfront cost in the LEDs that are available now, but the energy usage is just plummeting in terms of the load that's required to perform this from a cost benefit standpoint. So particularly, even if you can move the plants, which is also a way of doing it, the verticality is just off the charts relative to the amount of surface area you would need to accomplish the same amount of growth. And, you know, hydro has been commercialized significantly. I think, you know, if you went to the supermarket, anything you see with the root ball still intact, there's a lot of herbs being sold that way, a lot of lettuce plants. It's all hydroponics. A lot of the tomatoes are grown that way, even the peppers. If you follow the websites on the sticker of the produce that you might buy at the grocery store, generally you can get an idea of how it's grown, and I think you may be surprised how much hydroponic produce that you're eating already. So, you know, the future is really just kind of taking care of itself. You know, there are new technologies in terms of the efficiency of plant growth, particularly in grow lights, happening almost on a weekly basis. The cost of moving food around is getting more expensive. And so the rationale of growing plants hydroponically in a localized, decentralized approach is becoming more fruitful as time moves on. And, you know, part of the exercise of talking about it in sessions like this and just getting some information out there is to let people know that there's nothing innately toxic or harmful towards hydroponic growth. You know, and it is a very viable way of producing food. It's another image of one of those towers. You know, how cool is this concept? Every floor's got a different crop, and you catch the water, and, you know, solar panels to make it all off the grid. Amazing. And it will be done someday. And if somebody knows of an active commercial application for this type of thing, I'm all ears. I'd really like to be able to point to it, but to my knowledge, there's nothing that is in production at the moment. So the growing media used in hydro is soilless. These are 4 examples here. Hydroton are those baked clay balls up in the top right. It's just baked clay. It's porous, so it holds moisture as opposed to a marble. Other than that, it's pretty much marbles. You know, if you use marbles, you just have to flood the tray and irrigate it more because there was no moisture there once it's gone away. Core fiber is probably the fastest growing growing media. The grower we work with in Washington has to use a core fiber, peat moss growing media in order to certify themselves organic. In other words, they can't just grow the plant in water alone. They have to have a growing media that the plant grows in. That's the way the state of Washington has designed their certification standards. So core fiber is a lot more popular than peat moss these days because peat moss is a finite resource. A lot of the mines for peat moss are running out and are becoming more expensive. Core fiber is very renewable in that it's a byproduct of the coconut industry. So they basically just shred up all of the remnants of the coconut farms and sell it at different grades of the pith. It could look like coffee grounds, or it could look like like a small mulch, depending on how you want to buy it. But it's chemically inert. Most of the salts have been washed out of commercialized core fiber, and it works really well. Perlite, you've seen it in potting soil, little white specks. It's in potting soil to allow drainage because it doesn't retain moisture. It's just a heated rock that puffs up like popcorn, but it's not porous, so it won't hold moisture other than in between the media itself. And a lot of growers just use it as, on its own. And rock wool. Rock wool is, on the bottom there is basically like cotton candy, but it's rocks, if you will. And it's a pH alkaline because it's made with lime, so you have to condition it before you use it. But the reason it's used is because it's cheap, and because when you saturate it, it immediately drains to a 50-50 aeration, which is kind of what you want, 50% water, 50% air. So it's got the physical properties that hold moisture conducive to plant growth. And it works really well, and it really is cost effective. So most commercial applications on a big scale are using rock wool blocks, slabs, that sort of thing. So here's some images of some commercial hydroponic systems that you can buy. They're turnkey. They take a lot of the guesswork out of it. They work really well. I spent a lot of time in my day in my garden center before I closed it, talking people out of buying a hydroponic system and just building it on their own, which is also fairly simple to do. We saw some images of the water culture a minute ago, where you just basically get a net pot the roots can grow into the water and aerate it. Simple as that. These systems, bottom right is an NFT system. The one in the middle and the bottom is a flood and drain system. Top left is a drip system. And then the middle top is, as is the one on the right at the top, and the one in the middle is kind of a hybrid flood and drain with a controller of a fertilizer solution that floods and drains on a timer. So there's different methods, and I just wanted to kind of give you a visual so that we could get some vernacular. We talked about water culture. You can see this could be a silo cup with holes in it. It's a concept, not a product. Typically what's used is what's called net pots, which just are a pot with a net that allow the roots to grow through it. So you could even start plants in soil and put them in a hydroponic system if you wanted to. There's not a other than you don't want to put it in a full strength hydroponic system. You want to kind of harden the plant up to the concentration relative to what the soil is. As you can see, water culture is very simple. Ebb and flow is exactly what it says. So flood and drain is another way to say it. The GIF here gives you a little visual. So when the pump's on a timer, when the pump turns on, it floods the tray up to the water level. The overflow holds to that level when the pump's on, and when the pump turns off, all the water drains back through the pump. So really, it's just an automatic watering system. You could put plants in soil containers in this tray if you wanted to, and it would just water it for you, right? Just keep in mind that if you had soil that's designed to retain moisture, so you don't have to be there 6 times a day to water the plant, that you'd want to flood the tray a lot less than if you had a calibrated hydroponic media that was designed for drainage. Incidentally, that's one of the benefits of hydroponics, is not only the concentrational benefits that you can bring to the plant, but the ability to deliver more oxygen to the roots. If you can water the plant 6 times a day in a very porous media, then the air just pours through the growing media and the plant has maximum access to oxygen. So you can see that's a little bit different than in water culture, where the roots are always in the water. Different method, different way to the same place. So this is called a flood and drain system. A drip system is just a conversion of a flood and drain system. Instead of flooding the whole tray, you're just running it through emitters that target to the plant. Rather than fill the whole tray with something, I like to put containers in the tray. So the tray is just there to catch the water to return it. And then you this is a spider mechanism. Way I usually do it is just run some tubing out, plug the end of the tubing with an inline valve that stops the water, and then run drip emitters off of the main line tube to each plant. And so when the pump comes on, the water runs through the tubing, through the drip emitters, waters the plant, runs back to the reservoir, and you just time it out based on the number of times you want to feed the plant and irrigate the plant every day. So again, fairly straightforward. Nutrient film technique is a bit different in that, most of them you're pumping the water to the top of a gradient and letting it run down. That's the simplest way to do it. There's some commercial systems that run irrigation tube inside the PVC here and spray the water down into the film of water. Typically, you've got at the end here, you've got a little bit of a rise in your return, so it keeps an inch of water in this PVC tube. You can get these PVC tubes at a big box store. It's just vinyl fence posting. And then you basically just plug each end, drill a hole that holds the net pot, propagate your plant, put it in the net pot, roots grow into the tray, and you set your system up with your fertilizer pH balance, and there you have it. And then there's aeroponics. This one's misting the roots as opposed to saturating the roots. It's not my favorite because there's a lot of, you get the emitters clogged, things like that. If the pump breaks, there's no media or water for the plant to access, so you can, your plants will die very quickly. Not that your pump's going to break, but it can happen. But it is a technique, mostly in my experience, used for cloning plants, where you expose the tissue of the plant that you cut from a mother plant, and you miss the roots. You do get a higher amount of oxygen in the air relative to what you can accomplish in the water. So that is a reason to perform aquaponics, and it works really, really good as a cloning machine. And, maybe we can set up a do-it-yourself clone course. That's probably make a note of that, because that's a really simple thing to do, and you can get some really high rates of growth and replicability out of that. So that's kind of the systems, the growing media. I want to talk through the basics of the maintenance, and then we're going to compare kind of organic fertility to hydro fertility. So in hydro, you got to have a complete nutrient. What I mean by that is that I use the number 17 as the number of elements a plant requires to grow. So other people might say 15, some might say 18. Bit of an argument. I digress. But the point is, a plant has to have the essential elements present. Most hydroponic nutrients that you'll buy from a garden center have done that for you, so you don't have to worry about, will it grow the plant or not? It definitely will. They're all kind of a different flavor of the same thing. You typically have grow nutrients and bloom nutrients. The grow nutrients are going to have a higher amount of nitrogen than phosphorus and potassium, and the bloom nutrients are going to flip that ratio and have more phosphorus and potassium relative to nitrogen. The idea is, feeding the plant what it wants: nitrogen, stems and leaves; phosphorus, potassium, fruit and flower. Very general, but true. And so you'll notice hydroponic nutrients switch that emphasis, and it makes a really large difference in the yield of the plant. It's a lesson that we can learn and apply to our soil. If you're just using a 10-10-10 on your garden, you're not maximizing what the plant's capable of. You're giving it more nitrogen when it wants to be producing fruit. Even though you're giving it 10% phosphorus and potassium, you want to lessen that nitrogen. So that's kind of a takeaway there. But in hydroponics, you're adding the fertilizers to the water. You're then measuring, or not. You don't have to have a nutrient meter to do hydroponics. You can just do, a tablespoon per gallon, see how the plant does. Do 2. If it burns, step off and use 6 teaspoons. Do it generally in that way. And there's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't have to be perfect, but the potential of being able to read a number based on the result you're getting with your plant, and then knowledge that'll be pushed that plant with the number in mind, gives you data that you can't get generally. And typically, if you get into hydroponics, you'll buy a nutrient meter. It's not really something that needs to be sold to you, because you want to know. And that's, a lot of people gravitate towards particularly controlled environment agriculture because they want to know. They want to have control, and they want to set up the garden in that way. So, EC is a conversion of parts per billion. This can get complicated in that there's different parts per million scales. It's kind of like the US and metric system. They're different, but they mean the same thing. So 1 EC typically is 500 parts per million. In the end, frankly, the number, other than getting you started and giving you a framework, is not really relevant. The number could be 10 trillion and 4. And as long as you're connecting the rate of growth that you're getting and where the plant burns, the number is almost arbitrary. You know, it's not like you have to grow it to a certain number, because, you know, tomatoes, just like we're all people, I might eat twice as much as the next guy just because my metabolism is higher. We're still all people, right? Same with tomatoes. You can have some strains that want 1,500 and others that want 3,500. Just depends on their metabolism. So you can't really get that from a book. That's kind of the farming end of this, if you will. And then you move down through the pH and the dissolved oxygen. So we're going to talk through, show you a couple slides that kind of make the pH one a little bit easier. You know, this is the first 3-part hydroponic nutrient, the Flora series. A lot of other ones on the market now. This one was developed back in the 1970s. General Hydroponics was just purchased by the Hawthorne Group, which is a subsidiary of Scott's Miracle-Gro. It's a really big deal. It's about maybe over a year ago now, and it was really a marker of when the wall between the hydroponics world and the mainstream gardening world kind of crumbled. And it was a big play on Scott's Miracle-Gro part. I think primarily, I know some people in these companies, and I think primarily they knew the fertilizers that they had were not sufficient, and they had a whole generation of people growing up that, you know, had made that association. So they needed to kind of buy the biggest hydroponic fertilizer company, and they make organic fertilizers as well, that they could, and General Hydroponics is a pretty good one. So, you know, again, this formula has done the hard part for you. All you're worried about is the amount relative to the water. But it gives me an opportunity to talk about what we may be missing in hydroponics. This is really where organics makes a lot more sense from a nutrient density standpoint. You know, the concept of trace elements is underreported in agriculture, primarily because it's really difficult to put our finger on the mechanism of what every element does. But you can see we make a product called Earth Tonic, and it's got literally every earthbound element on Earth, and we combine different regional, ancient, and deep sea mineral sources, sea mineral sources, with the biodynamic preparations and some other goodies. And basically the end result is every element on Earth in balance. So you can see the coverage elementally of you know, Earth Tonic versus a typical fertilizer. And it's a fair question. You know, what does cadmium do in a garden? What does you know, tellurium do in a garden? You know, can I tell you exactly what it does? No. I mean, maybe with some research, but the story gets too long for people, and we really reduce it down to you know, what it has to be. And that's really what a hydroponic nutrient is. It's what the plant has to have, not what the plant wants. So the liability that I point out in hydroponics is if you're just using a base fertilizer, you're accomplishing plant growth, and arguably you're doing a better job of it than what you buy at the grocery store. I think there's no doubt about that, but it's not what it could be. And so this is really why we make Earth Tonic as a supplement to the base fertility of the hydroponics. You know, my mantra is always, you know, if it's not the soil, it's not the plant, it's not the plant, it's not the people. You could amend that for hydroponics. It's not the hydroponic system, it's not the plant, it's not the plant, it's not the people, right? So if you grow a plant with 17 elements, you know, I could probably spend an hour on this thought that I just had, but that plant has to end up with more than 17 elements, right? How does that work? Is that what they call alchemy, magic? I don't really know. But there is a point at which you start to lose the ability to make logical sense of how everything's working. The best effort that you can undertake is to ensure that all those elements are there to work with, because without a doubt, if those more than 17 elements are not there, the large majority of them are not being incorporated into the plant tissue, into the plant ability that it has to be itself to make its own antibiotics and its own you know, terpenes and you know, antifreezes and vitamins and different things that we use plants for. So we don't want to restrict the plant. So you can see a little bit of a schematic here, the macronutrients and the micronutrients. These elements are typically what you'll see in a hydroponic nutrient in the blue, and in the green there's, you know, upwards of 70 to 80 additional elements that bring the complexity and, you know, increase the flavor of food. You know, this food tastes better than that. Well, the reason is the plant had more of an ability to express its plantness, right? So, you know, the trace elements cannot be understated. This graph, something we made up for Earth Tonic, it just shows, you can see down from cobalt and above, on the hydroponic nutrient line. Those are the elements required to be present for a plant to fully mature itself in water. And if you notice, budget fertilizers, they're missing half of those elements. So it's incomplete. And it's a great analogy is fast food. You know, it's not going to kill you directly, but it's going to create degeneration over time. And that's basically what happens to the large majority of conventional hobby gardeners and even farmers for that matter. They're using fertilizers that are providing enough result to continue using them, but degenerate with time. Kind of like fast food. It's enough to fill you up and make you feel satisfied, but you know, if you eat fast food for every meal, you know, we make movies out of it, right? Go watch Super Size Me or Fast Food Nation or one of those programs. They show that, you know, life degenerates with an incomplete diet. So compare that to Earth Tonic, and it's got over 90 elements in it. Notice that the NPK, the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, which are the macronutrients, what plants need most of, is very low. And we don't mess with the balance. We can, of course, add different NPK to Earth Tonic and make it a complete fertilizer. Our approach is to position it to supplement all the rest of them. So it kind of fills in the gaps, if you will. And it's totally food grade, actually. I use it to remineralize my drinking water, have for over a decade. It originally formulated it to be a wheatgrass fertilizer. It works amazing for sprouts, like seed soaking, and wheatgrass in particular increases the flavor exponentially. It's quite remarkable. So, you know, we talked about these benefits of hydroponics. It's just a slide to you know, make that very obvious. It's growing up, not down, and it's the root oxygen. So I think I skipped the slide there. Man, let's do this. So check this out. This is just some data around what I was referencing earlier in the lettuce and the tomato. You see how different the parts per million concentrations are? That means you wouldn't want to grow those plants in the same system. Now, the thought then comes, well, do I have to have a different system for every plant that I grow? And the answer is no. The way I handle that is, you know, leafy greens, herbs, things that don't produce a fruit, kind of in the lower categories, say below 1,000 parts per million. You know, 1,000 to 2,000 parts per million is kind of everything else that produces a fruit. Peppers, strawberries, etc. And then tomatoes are somewhat of an outlier. I don't really like to grow tomatoes in the same system as anything else because you can really push tomatoes to high concentrations, and the rates of growth that you get out of it are pretty exciting to see. So, you know, if anybody needs guidance setting this kind of thing up at their house and to have an experience, I did this for 15 years. I'm more than happy to help you with it. And here's some of the reason why to do it. You know, I mean, you see tomato grown at 1,600 parts per million versus 2,450. You know, the increase of the shelf life that you see of the sap, the bricks, the acids, a lot of the reasons that you're growing these plants are all increased across the board when the plant can draw more from its fertility without having to work for it. So there's, you know, very real reasons to pay attention to these kinds of things. So pH and dissolved oxygen, we're going to finish talking up those components. You can see this chart's used mostly in hydroponic applications. It's the thickness of the line represents the availability. So you can see, like in this little window right here from 6 to 7, let's say 6.5, all of the lines are thickest. That tends to be when the plant, when all the elements are most available to the plant. So if you have a pH that's lower, that's high, it's not that it's killing the plant being too alkaline or acidic, it's just that it's reducing the availability of target elements. It's interesting to note that, you know, when you work with base saturation in soil, which we'll get into in the coming weeks, when you've got the base saturation within a relative balance, you know, 60% calcium, 20 magnesium, 7 potassium, 4 sodium, and the rest are micros, and you got it, the pH is 6.5. It's right where you want it to be. It's also interesting to note that at 6.5, generally those elements are most available. So there's really like a sweet spot of life in this pH range. And we won't do it today, but we'll get real comfortable with pH and then when we do the soil testing in the coming weeks, because it's something that I think people have a misunderstanding about. It's really just a measurement of hydrogen ions. So something that's acidic simply is empty from a soil standpoint, and specifically has just a high number of hydrogen ions relative to other elements. But so basically what this means in hydro is you add your fertilizer, let it become a uniform solution, take a sample. If the pH is low or high, you're going to use pH up or pH down, depending on the scenario. And what you get out of that is somewhat of an equation. If you're using the same container, same amount of water, you're switching your reservoir every 2 weeks, kind of like switching your oil every 3,000 miles. You don't have to do that, but you can. And the reasons that you do that are two. One is that, no nutrient is crop specific unless you've done tissue analysis. So if your plant wants 2% calcium and you've got 1 in the nutrient, for 2 weeks, it's going to be fine. You just dump whatever's left after the 2 weeks and refresh it back to that 1%. If you top off, which you can do, over time, that deficiency is compounded upon itself. So, you do it and say you do it for 6 weeks and you start getting issues and you're not switching your reservoir out. Well, maybe that's it. And you got to start doing it to see if it's corrected. The other reason is concentrationally. If you have 1,000 parts per million when you start of a 20-gallon res, let's say, when you got 10 gallons, that concentration is going to be higher because the plant is using more water and transpiration than fertilizer to form the plant. So essentially the concentration is going to increase. So if you're topping off with a full strength solution over time, the concentration compounds and you'll burn your plant. You can get around that with the nutrient meter. But having said all of that, I've grown crops where I never switched the reservoir out because it was a pain in the ass to get to, and I just put quarter strength nutrient solution in it. So you can take this as loosely as you want. And dissolved oxygen is done through air stones. I think we've probably covered this verbally already. You can do that with a water pump by breaking the surface of the water, creating turbulence. You can also do it through air stones that break the bubbles up. It is really important to do that in hydroponics, actively in water culture, and at least allowing the plant the oxygen through the growing media otherwise. So with that understanding of hydroponics and, with a general understanding of soil, this is just a quick comparison here. This, you're growing plant in both applications. Soil, you're feeding the soil. Hydroponics, you're feeding the plant. Soil, in organic growing, as many things as it's identified to, healthy food, no toxins, all of these kinds of things. What it really is organic fertilizers feed microbes and artificial fertilizers don't. That's about as simple as you can make organic growing. But the organic, in order to feed the microbes, they have to be there to be fed, right? So that's the next section we'll move into after we get through the soil testing stuff on the mineral component of bioenergetic agriculture. We're going to start talking about the biological, which gets into composting, soil food web, compost tea, things like that. Because so many times people are undertaking organic methods, like at a home garden or even on a farm that was chemically treated. They're looking to regenerate, and they're putting out all of these good building materials, these good organic fertilizers, but there's no diversity in the soil food web, and there's no construction workers there to put it into play. And it's just a shame, because in that respect, if you're using organic fertilizers, well, that's great. You're probably getting a better result compared to Miracle-Gro, for example, but you're paying more for it too, right? And if you can't get the soil to work for you from a food web standpoint, you're going to have to use that fertilizer for the rest of your life to get the result, because a fertilizer is a crutch, right? I mean, you don't have to use fertilizer in a healthy living system. It's a compensation for the inability of the soil to do that for you. So our goal in soil organic growing is to grow the soil's capacity to be soil and remove the human responsibility and budget, frankly. In hydro, you're taking it the exact opposite approach. You can leverage microbes in hydroponics, and you can perform organic hydroponics, which we'll kind of finish up with here in a minute. But essentially, you're feeding the plant directly. You're separating the agronomy from nature, and you're creating a system that does that for us. And with that activity, we're saving water. We're using less fertilizer. We're, getting definite tangible benefits, particularly if we can pay attention to that trace element realm and make sure that we're not restricting the plant's ability to pull from what it might get in a natural living system. But that articulation of feeding the soil versus feeding the plant is very important. So, hydroponics can be organic. This is a little compost tea brew that I set up with my son, he's 5. We brew tea once a week for our home garden. We're renting at the moment and sold our home about 6 months ago, and just transitioning, looking for a place that we want to be. And, you know, I've just got a container garden that's killing me right now. But, you know, brewing compost tea and leveraging microbes, essentially compost tea is just aerating water, adding high quality compost so the microbes can breathe, and then feeding them organic fertilizers. It's a concentration of that point that I made on the last slide. The organic fertilizers allow the microbes to grow to extraordinary concentrations. And at the same time, you're making perfect plant food. So you can engineer compost tea recipes and then leverage microbes' ability to make that available in an uber sense. And, you know, custom create fertilizer solutions for leveraging complete nutrients in hydroponics. Know a lot of people that do that. You can also today buy organic fertilizers in the garden center that are certified organic and that will accomplish good quality growth in hydroponic applications. They tend to be a lot more expensive, but it is doable. They're a bit of a different animal. You don't pH balance those solutions. Like with the artificial salts, you put it in the water and then you pH balance it because the chemistry makes it available, right? In organic fertilizers, best way I can describe it is Mother Nature makes them available. You don't need to pH balance the chemistry to make the availability. And you also don't want to aerate certain organic fertilizers, not the tea approach. But and I don't really have a good explanation as to why that is. It's just some advice that I got from manufacturers. So, you know, I've aerated the same organic hydroponic nutrients and it didn't explode or anything like that. So I need to get some more information on why that is. But the point that I'd like to make is, you know, it's a different animal, right? You don't pH balance it. You probably want to switch your reservoir out a little bit more, maybe once a week. Otherwise, especially if you're not aerating it, you're going to get some anaerobic conditions, some smells, things like that. So it's a little messier. I mean, you know, it's nothing wrong with getting your hands dirty, making a mess. But it is more of an R&D exercise. It's not as simple and soluble as salts are. So the epitome of that idea is aquaponics. You know, many of you have, I'm sure, heard of that. And it's just this graphic makes it plain. The fish waste is turned into by microbes, by the soil food web. The ammonia is turned into a nitrate that the plant can use as fertilizer, which cleans the water. And, you know, there's a balance between the amount of fish waste you have and the crop growth that you're accomplishing. And, you know, generally you want about 1 gallon of growing media for every gallon of water that you have in your reservoir, assuming your fish are maxed out. And there's great resources on aquaponics. But that's what's happening in nature, right? You got a pond, fish are swimming around in it. And, you know, like you may have seen golf courses where you have algae outbreaks in the retention ponds and ponds on the course, and has to do with a high rate of fertilizer coming in, the ponds being dead due to the artificiality of the agronomy, and the algae is out competing the bacteria. So there's a lot of the better products other than algicides on the market, which just blow the problem up for it to reconstitute, are bacterial products that outcompete the algae for the food source, which cleans the pond, treats the root of the issue. That's happening by default without human influence. So aquaponics is really just that concept of you know, acquiring a natural process for human benefit. It works amazing once you got it set up. There's a bit of a disconnect in regards to its commerciality. I've yet to hear of really high-end commercial, high productive environments that are turning profits farming aquaponics. It has a lot to do with just the upfront costs of setting it up. But the concept works very well. I've done many systems myself. It's simple to set up at home. And, you know, if you're into that kind of thing, definitely seek it out. It's, you know, as I like to say, it's the end of food. You're producing it based on the waste stream of the fish, you know, and you're eating both sides. So, you know, just a couple of references for, you know, if you're really into organic hydroponics. Rather than spend a lot of time going through some detail, there's a really great Facebook page my friend Keith runs. It's Organic Hydroponics. You just search it. It's a group on Facebook. And he is a tinkerer with his greenhouse in Texas and performs deliberate biological soups that cycle nitrogen at a high rate, not unlike what you do in aquaponics, but he's doing it deliberately to make fertilizer. And he uses his urine and all kinds of cool stuff. And he pointed me towards this multiple parallel mineralization by a Japanese researcher, Makoto Shinohara, and has kind of used his process to basically make fertilizer for himself. It's really very cool. So, you know, this is some steps towards his process. He's doing aquaponics with no fish, but I'd invite you to seek his page out and ask questions if you're curious. He's a really good resource for this kind of thing. So, takeaways, you know, a plant is a plant, somewhat obvious. But think of it this way: don't treat your soil like a hydroponic system, right? It's like if you're using Miracle-Gro or artificial fertilizers in soil, you are treating the soil unconsciously like a hydroponic system. And you're really creating all of the issues that you're experiencing. You know, Charles Walters, I'm a fan of using his term toxic rescue chemistry, right? We use artificiality in a living system. Issues rear their head due to the imbalances that we're creating, and here we go trying to kill them all, right? So, you know, taking a step back and really kind of thinking about what it is we're doing and why we're doing it can change the way that we grow in a very productive way. And for me, I like to talk about the organic versus hydroponic for that very reason, because the irony is people are trying to grow a hydroponic system in their yard, in their garden, in their farm, and they're screwing everything up. So if you take one thing away, that's from this, you know, time together, that would be it. You know, use organic fertilizers because they grow the soil, not because, you know, they're good for the earth. That's just the cherry on top, if you will. So I, as always, appreciate everyone's time. If there's any comments or questions, I'll always look forward to what you guys have to say out there.